Let's think a little bit more about contradictions in the Bible. I had said, in response to the idea that pointing out contradictions in the Bible is a modern thing to do, that actually no, the author of Chronicles is aware of several contradictions in earlier parts of the Bible and then takes steps to try to fix those contradictions. I also said that the author of Chronicles introduces additional contradictions into their version of the history of Israel and Judah, and that they must know that these are contradictions because, of course, they have those texts that they are contradicting sitting directly in front of them. This commenter then asked for examples, which I'm happy to provide. Many of these examples you can also find in my somehow not yet finished 20-part series on the differences between Chronicles and Samuel and Kings. Regardless, I think it'll be nice to have all these examples of contradictions in one place, and then you can share this video with anybody who's interested in thinking more about contradictions in the Bible, or you could send it in a passive-aggressive fashion to people who don't think that there are any contradictions in the Bible, and such people will open the video and they'll see my moderately brown face and they'll hear my feminine voice, and they can educate themselves on these interesting contradictions between Chronicles and other books in the Bible. So without further ado, here are 3 examples of contradictions in earlier parts of the Bible that the author of Chronicles tries to fix, and 3 examples of contradictions that the author of Chronicles introduces into their version of the history of Israel and Judah. Let's start with the contradictions the author of Chronicles tries to fix first. Number 1, a contradiction concerning the sovereignty of Solomon. In 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 24, we're told that Solomon is sovereign over the entire region from the Euphrates River to Gaza all the days of his life. But in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 11, we're told that Solomon trades away 20 of his cities to Hiram, king of Tyre, in exchange for wood and gold. Now, obviously, if you trade away 20 cities to a different king, you are no longer sovereign over those cities. So the question is Solomon sovereign over this expansive terrain, or is he not? Well, 1 Kings chapter 4 seems to think he is, but 1 Kings chapter 9 concedes that he is not. The author of Chronicles tries to fix this contradiction by reversing who gives the cities to who. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 2, it's actually King Hiram who gives the cities to Solomon, and Solomon who, out of his benevolence, rebuilds the cities. So if Solomon is receiving cities rather than giving them away, then he can still be sovereign over the entire region from the Euphrates to Gaza. Problem solved. Number 2, a contradiction in the Passover instructions. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 9, the people of Israel are commanded in no uncertain terms that they should not boil. The Hebrew word here is bashal. They should not boil, but rather instead should roast in fire the Passover lamb. But in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 7, they are told to boil the Passover lamb, the same word bashal. This is a bit of a problem for the author of Chronicles, because the author of Chronicles would very much like King Josiah to celebrate the Passover in this extravagant ceremony, and would very much like Josiah to celebrate the Passover according to the law as it was given. But that's a bit of a problem because the law as it was given contradicts itself. So the author of Chronicles says in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verse 13, that Josiah boils it in fire. Now, obviously, this is impossible. You cannot boil something in fire. To boil something is to cook it in water. You cannot be both in fire and in water at the same time. That's silly. Nevertheless, this is a way for the author of Chronicles to try to pay some lip service to both of the contradictory commands that are given in earlier parts of the Bible. Number 3, a contradiction concerning the death of Goliath. I've talked about this example several times before, but in 1 Samuel chapter 17, in a very famous story, David kills Goliath. But in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 19, in a much less famous story, one of David's elite soldiers named Elhanan kills Goliath instead. The author of Chronicles chooses to handle this contradiction in 2 ways. First of all, the author of Chronicles chooses not to narrate David's fight with Goliath, so out of sight, out of mind. The second way they choose to handle it is that in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 5, the author of Chronicles has Elhanan kill Goliath's brother, somebody named Lachmi, instead. Now, this is an impossible name. The name Lachmi would just mean my bread, and it's just taken from the end of the word Bethlehemite. Elhanan was described as a Bethlehemite. The author of Chronicles just chops up this word Bethlehemite, takes the last few letters, and makes it into a name for the brother of Goliath. But nobody else anywhere in the ancient Near East is named anything like this. It's just a fantastical name that the author of Chronicles invents in order to try to sidestep this contradiction. Now let's talk about 3 examples of contradictions that the author of Chronicles introduces into their version of the history of Israel and Judah, knowing full well that they are contradictions because, of course, they have these earlier texts sitting in front of them as a reference point. Number 1, a contradiction concerning which of Jesse's sons David is. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 10 and 11, we learn that David is the 8th and youngest of Jesse's sons. But in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 15, in Jesse's genealogy, we are told that David is Jesse's seventh son instead. Now, some people try to explain this away by saying that perhaps by the time the genealogy was composed for 1 Chronicles chapter 2, one of David's older brothers had died, making him the seventh and youngest of those brothers. That would work if both of these stories was simply enumerating how many sons Jesse happened to have, and that's sort of what's happening in the 1 Samuel example, but that's not what's happening in the 1 Chronicles example, which is actually giving a list of birth order, and birth order, as in seventh to be born, is not something that changes depending on how many older siblings you happen to have left alive. Your birth order is your birth order regardless. I've also heard some people say that this is like a heroic trope, like being born seventh is a special number. So the text in Chronicles is sort of according David some praise by having him born seventh. But there's absolutely no evidence for this. This happens nowhere else in Chronicles, nowhere else in the Bible, nowhere else in the ancient Near East that I'm familiar with. And if this really was the case, then the author of 1 Samuel would have done it to begin with, because David was already famous by the time that earlier text was composed. Number 2, a contradiction concerning Saul's divination. In 1 Samuel chapter 28, verse 6, on the eve of battle with the Philistines, Saul attempts to inquire of God concerning the outcome of the battle, which a good king ought to do before they go out to war. Unfortunately for Saul, the author of 1 Samuel does not like Saul very much, and so God does not like Saul very much in the book of 1 Samuel. And so when Saul attempts to inquire of God, God just leaves Saul on red. But in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 14, the author of Chronicles says that Saul does not inquire of the Lord at all. This is a pretty basic contradiction. Does Saul inquire of the Lord before the battle or not? 1 Samuel says yes. 1 Chronicles says no. There's really no way to resolve that contradiction. Theologically, I think it's pretty clear that the author of Chronicles is just uncomfortable with the idea that a king of Israel and Judah would inquire of God and God would just not get back to them. And so they change the story so that Saul just never inquires of God in the first place. This is in line with a lot of the other theological changes that the author of Chronicles likes to make in these previous stories. Number 3, a contradiction in the celebration of the Passover. Again, kind of. It's complicated. In 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 21 through 23, we're told that Josiah celebrates the Passover as part of his sweeping reforms, and he celebrates the Passover in a way that it's never been celebrated before. And that makes a lot of sense in that context, because if we read the preceding stories in 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, we don't get a description of any previous king celebrating the Passover at all, let alone celebrating it as extravagantly as Josiah is said to in 2 Kings. Now, the author of Chronicles keeps this story. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, which is the parallel passage to 2 Kings chapter 23, Josiah still celebrates the Passover. Indeed, the author of Chronicles keeps some of that same language from 2 Kings in order to describe how Josiah goes about celebrating the Passover in the same unprecedented way. The problem is that in 2 Chronicles, it's not actually unprecedented, because in 2 Chronicles chapter 30, the author of Chronicles massively expands Hezekiah's reforms, including a grand celebration of the Passover. In 2 Chronicles 30, Hezekiah is said to celebrate the Passover like nobody had before, using almost exactly the same language that is then later applied to Josiah. So who is actually the first to celebrate the Passover in this way? In 2 Kings, it's pretty clear, because in 2 Kings, Hezekiah doesn't celebrate the Passover, just Josiah later. But in 2 Chronicles, it's much more confusing, because not only does the author of Chronicles copy that celebratory and unprecedented language from 2 Kings, but they seem to forget that they had actually added this whole section previously, 5 chapters before in 2 Chronicles 30, where Hezekiah celebrates in this unprecedented way. In conclusion, when people say today that there are no contradictions in the Bible, they're really saying something opposite of what the Bible itself is willing to admit to. Saying there are no contradictions in the Bible ends up being a very unbiblical thing to say, because when you say there are no contradictions in the Bible, you're committed to trying to explain in an ad hoc fashion how all these merely apparent contradictions are merely apparent, and doing that almost always involves adding new extra-biblical information to the text. And so such a person isn't so much reading the Bible as they are reading the Bible plus a bunch of commentary that they've had to invent in order to try to reconcile these contradictions. And at that point, the Bible is no longer a book that exists objectively out there in the world that anybody can read. The Bible has just become a figment of your imagination that sort of changes whenever you need it to change so that it can live up to this unbiblical standard that you've imposed on it. And for anyone who actually cares about the Bible, that's obviously a considerable loss.